Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, our continuing video series, Trump's Trade War. We're at day 10, and each and every day here at The Hub, we're going to provide you with a short 10-minute video or less that gets you up to speed on some of the important issues and ideas and debates that are circling around the big trade threat facing Canada right now. We're exceedingly fortunate to have on the program today Jay Goldberg. He is the Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Jay, great to have you on the program.
Great to be with you.
Let's talk about your article today in the Hub. It's all about interprovincial trade barriers and how they could be, maybe should be, a big part of Canada's response to the Trump trade and tariff threat. Let's start, Jay, with what is the state of free trade or internal trade inside Canada right now?
The state of internal trade in Canada right now is not good. Essentially, it's easier for most Canadian provinces to trade with a couple dozen different countries through our free trade agreements than it is to trade with each other. Right now, we technically have internal free trade in Canada, but there's more than 400 different carve-outs that essentially make it far less free or fair to trade here within Canada than it would be to trade with other countries. So that's why you're seeing politicians of all stripes really starting to talk about, with the Trump tariff threat really bearing down on Canada's economy, you're finally having, I think, across the spectrum, folks saying, you know, we really have to make sure we trade more at home. And the numbers certainly bear out the fact that if we were to take down those internal trade barriers, the benefit we could get to our economy from doing so could even offset the costs of the potential 25% Trump tariffs that are being threatened right now.
So, Jay, why haven't we done this before? If, as your article suggests, there are big GDP upsides for us, i.e., more economic activity, if we were trading with each other, this would seem like something obvious that maybe should have happened years ago. Does that make you a little bit concerned that there might be some powerful vested interests here that aren't really interested, frankly, in challenging the status quo, even in the face of this new trade threat we have coming from the United States?
There are definitely powerful interests out there that, you know, and even when you're negotiating a free trade deal with another country, there's always powerful interests that are trying to block it. The thing is, for example, when Canada negotiated a free trade agreement with the United States, it was one government, the Mulroney government, negotiating with the Reagan administration. In Canada, if we were to try to attempt to do this, and hopefully we will, you're going to have 13 different provincial and territorial governments and probably the federal government being involved. So that's a lot more interests at play, and it's also a lot more different points where lobbyists and special interest groups and various industry groups will try to push for exceptions. And so I think that's been one of the choke points here, is that you actually have a lot more players at the table when you're trying to negotiate this than you do when you're just negotiating a bilateral free trade deal with another country.
Jay, does the federal government have certain powers that they can exert here? You know, you hear these arguments over the years, well before this crisis right now, where people say, look, there are trade and commerce powers that the federal government has in Canada to realize maybe not a perfect free trade, but certainly a lot of trade liberalization inside our borders. In other words, Jay, is this something that we can move on quickly in the face of the Trump trade threat? Or, I don't know, are we going to be disappointed maybe that this could take months? I don't want to suggest this, but is this something that's going to take years to happen?
Well, I mean, look, the federal government transfers tens of billions of dollars every year to the provinces through various transfer agreements. And I think, you know, in a moment like this, for the federal government to say, look, we all have to sit down, we have to negotiate this, we have to come up with a deal here to get genuine free trade here in Canada. And we're going to put some provincial funding on the table, potential cuts to funding on the table if we don't get this done. I think this is just such an imperative situation right now. The upside to the national economy is so great. The upside to every province's economy is so great through tearing these internal barriers down that we just can't let vested interest stand in the way. And the federal government in the past has been reluctant to sort of, use its big stick that it could actually use to force the provinces to get this done, and that is through funding. And so the federal government does this in a whole host of other areas to get the provinces to essentially go along with what they'd like to see. And so I think this is another area where they could say, look, we transfer a lot of money to various provincial governments, and at a minimum, you have to sit down and negotiate at the table in good faith. We have a period of 30 days, for example, where we have to get this done, and let's negotiate to get as many barriers down as possible. But I think the existential threat we're facing, the idea that we could have a recession that's twice as severe as the pandemic recession, which is essentially what's being projected by economists if these tariffs were to come into place. I think all of this should give enough impetus to our politicians to at least get them to the table and let's negotiate something.
Jay, give us some of the numbers in your article. You're using some bank estimates of like the potential impact of these 25% tariffs if they did come on, and then some other research by the McDonald-Laurier Institute and other organizations that have looked at the beneficial GDP effects. It could be quite high, couldn't it, Jay, in terms of stimulating tens of billions of
It,
dollars of new economic activity in Canada?
it could be. The McDonald-Laurier Institute study shows that our GDP is about somewhere between 3 and 7% smaller than it could be if we didn't have these internal trade barriers. And you just think of what 7% of our GDP would be. That's astronomical. And you compare that to the cost of the Trump tariffs, which have been estimated by RBC and others to be around 3.2% or so to a GDP, which again would be a very significant recession. But you could have almost doubled the impact of getting rid of those internal trade barriers if we were to get this right. And so that's why it's so important. And even the IMF did a study quite recently that showed if we got rid of these internal trade barriers, our economy would grow by more than $200 billion a year. And so again, all of these numbers are pointing to some very significant upsides to getting rid of these internal trade barriers. And again, the idea that we are very much facing this American threat, it's been paused for 30 days, but we just saw, for example, the US administration announce tariffs on steel and aluminum. That's still coming into place. Maybe a week after they said we're going to hit the pause button. Who knows what could be coming to the auto sector in the future? So even if Trump doesn't go forward with the cross-the-board tariffs, he's going forward with tariffs. There's no question about it. And so our response has to be tearing down these internal trade barriers, which would be a huge boon to our economy. And, Canada's economy has been stagnating really for at least 10 years. And this would be some way to really jolt it, to get it started. And this is something that we absolutely have to do, given the threat that we're facing, but also given the stagnation that we've had for the past decade.
Jay, just finally, what's the type of process that we could see to bring this about? Like, is this, I don't know, a first minister's meeting? Is it something just frankly we need leadership from our federal government on now? Maybe, as you say, a combination of carrot and stick here to bring the provinces to heel on this, to finally realize some kind of genuine economic union inside Canada. How could you see this happening practically?
Well, I think a first minister's meeting is going to be absolutely crucial because you've heard every premier virtually say that this is something that's important. Doug Ford has said it, Tim Houston said it. They've all said that these internal trade barriers are ridiculous, and yet they're in place. And we have our internal trade minister, Anita Anand, who's actually said that she's seen such momentum behind this since the Trump tariff threat that she thinks this could get done in pretty short order. Again, that's pretty ambitious in terms of a statement, but I hope she's right. And she could convene the trade ministers for all the provinces tomorrow. She could call a meeting with the premiers, and I'm sure they would be there to try to get this done. But it definitely is going to take leadership from the federal government to actually get all the premiers, get all the provinces in the same room. All of the two previous internal free trade deals that we've had, and again, they've had a lot of exceptions, and so they haven't been all that effective. But both of them have taken leadership from Ottawa, so there's going to have to be some sort of leadership to get everybody in a room and get this done.
Okay, Jay, from your lips to our, well, soon to be former prime minister and our premier's ears, let's get free trade in Canada done. Let's tear down some walls, as you write today in the Hub. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.
That was Jay Goldberg. He's the Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the publisher of The Hub. Thank you for tuning in today's edition of Trump's Trade War. Every day we're going to get you videos and insights from our best commentators and thinkers, hopefully help all of us reflect and understand this big moment that Canada faces. Thanks for watching. We'll be back to you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.